Welcome back to Grow with Michael Sinclair. My name is Michael Sinclair and I'm a growth guide. And today I want to talk more about unworthiness and the unworthiness wound that I discovered about a year and a half ago. An unworthiness wound that caused me to self-sabotage quite often, that caused me to start projects and never finish them, that caused me to believe that I wasn't good enough to succeed in the way that I wanted to succeed, and that, the root cause of my failure was just based in inadequacy. So in yesterday's video, I kind of, started talking about this unworthiness wound that I discovered and how I discovered it. And I started talking about how once I discovered this unworthiness wound, I kept asking myself, why do you feel unworthy, Michael? Why do you feel unworthy? Why do you feel unworthy? And how that question did make some progress, right? That question got me to understanding, well, a part of why I feel unworthy is because I grew up black in a predominantly white town, or in a town where, I grew up in a town when I was growing up. We had a Ku Klux Klan museum on our town square, if that tells you anything. And that's not to say it was a totally terrible place, but it was certainly a place where being black wasn't super valued, and it was kind of put into your face that it wasn't super valued, right? On top of that, I grew up in what I would describe as poverty. My mom certainly felt poor, and she would often describe us as poor, and so poor was a large part of my identity for a long time. And I guess being one of the smarter kids, right? I was often in classes with a lot of white kids, a lot of kids who were a lot more privileged than I was, a lot of kids who grew up middle class, who had two-story houses, which to me meant that you were rich at the time, or, had two parents in the household. So, you would often get that support from parents that I was unable to get. And then also being a more sensitive little boy growing up in an area where masculinity was pretty much defined by being aggressive, being mean, being hard. Being hard was the thing to be, being tough, right? And so all those things kind of attributed to my unworthiness, right? But like I said in my last video, these are all things that I had faced and accepted and worked through in adulthood. So what I didn't understand was why these things were continuing to make me feel unworthy. And what I discovered was, why do you feel unworthy is the wrong question. The right question is, who made you feel unworthy? Who made you feel unworthy? Who made you feel unworthy is the right question, because no one is born feeling unworthy. No one is born feeling inadequate. No one is born feeling like, they don't have what it takes to create the life that they want to create. But rather, these ideas are placed into our heads at some point along our journey, right? And like I said in my last video, for the most part, I have been validated by strangers throughout my life, like in school, in classes with teachers, like being placed in like accelerated classes, gifted and talented classes, having teachers kind of like single me out and saying, hey, I want you to do this. In the arts, with girls, like even with dudes, like I kind of, once I understood that, being soft wasn't going to be accepted, I kind of put on a mask like I feel like a lot of other dudes did, and I played tough just like other guys did. And I mean, I rarely had negative experiences with people that kind of made me feel unworthy, rather, or strangers, rather. I did have negative experiences with people that made me feel unworthy, which brings me back to my point. Who made you feel unworthy? So once I kind of eliminated strangers from the equation, that really only left one group of people who could possibly make me feel unworthy. And if you guessed my family, you are absolutely correct. So like, that was a major light bulb moment when I realized that. Like, who made me feel the most unworthy was the people who had the most access to me, the people who have the most influence over me during my formative years, right? So if you think we all come into this world, if you think about it, we all come into this world as sort of a blank slate. We don't know anything about anything for the most part. Maybe we have some basic, primal instincts to eat, to cry, to poop, to, do all those basic things. But as far as what we think about ourselves and what we think about the world, these things are especially influenced by our family, right? And the more and more I thought about it, the more and more it made absolute sense why it was my family that made me feel unworthy. I had a tough childhood. I mean, relatively speaking, I think, there's certainly a spectrum, and I certainly didn't have it as rough as a lot of people have it. I certainly didn't have it as good as a lot of people have it. And I don't really think that matters. Like, I think we oftentimes get caught up in that. Well, I had a house all the time. I never really missed a meal. Who am I to say that I didn't have a rough childhood? But it doesn't really work that way. Like, suffering is relative, experience is relative. And relatively speaking, I had a tough childhood, in large part due to familial circumstances. So I am one of 3 boys. My mother has been a single parent pretty much perpetually. She was with my father maybe the first 2 or 3 years of my life. But after that, he pretty much abandoned me. And growing up in a small town, he always lived no more than 5 minutes away. And for whatever reason, I think a large part of the reason was due to his relationship with my mother. He decided not to come around a lot. And that had an incredible influence on me and how I saw myself and how worthy or unworthy I felt, right? So you have one of the most important people in my life, my father, right? Literally 5 minutes away from me, and would choose to actively not be in my life. And you have to think, like, what sort of effect that would have on a small child. So it wasn't just my father, but also my mother. My mother grew up in Brooklyn, New York. She grew up in Marcy Projects, the same projects that Jay-Z made famous. She grew up with a very hard childhood as well, not just in her own family unit, but the environment that she was in. She's a bit of a paradox because she's hard, she's tough, but it's kind of like her shell. And on the inside, she's super sensitive and sweet. But growing up, like, raising boys, right? Raising boys on her own, I feel like she leaned a lot more into her masculine energy, or at least what she thought, masculinity looked like, which for her was, raising tough boys, being hard, being rigid, being, kind of cold and being kind of mean and strict. And so between my mother and my father, I had on my mother's side, someone who I felt like couldn't affirm me, someone who I felt like couldn't really support me because she didn't learn how, she didn't get that support herself and didn't really learn how to do that. And then you have a father who I really looked up to, really admired, unfortunately, who I look very similar to, right? Who just seemed to not want me at all. And of course, this deeply contributed to the unworthiness that I was feeling. So I wrote about this in one of my newsletters, a newsletter entitled, Who Made You Feel Unworthy? And I just want to read a couple of the paragraphs that I wrote about realizing that it was my family that kind of placed this unworthiness on me. So, speaking about who made me feel unworthy, it was my mother and her inability to affirm me. It was her always having criticism or punishment ready when I fell short, but rarely ever praise, words of affirmation, or support when I excelled. It was her constant reminders that we were poor, subtly ingraining the belief that because we had less, I deserved less from others and from life itself. It was my father and his decision to effectively abandon me. His firstborn son, who looked just like him, idolized him, and wanted nothing more than to be just like him. It was his indifference to my existence and my desire for him. Like, how could I not feel unworthy when my hero lived 5 minutes away from me, and yet I'd go weeks, months, and years without seeing him or hearing from him? It was my brother and my older cousins constantly challenging my manhood. It was being made to feel like being sensitive made me less of a man. It was having to fight physically, mentally, and emotionally for the right to exist on what seemed like a daily basis. These repeated lessons, taught through words, actions, and inactions, deeply ingrained the belief that I was unworthy of acceptance in my authentic state. It led me to think that to succeed in this world, I needed to change who I was. And that's why, even though I had accepted myself fully as an adult now, I still doubted whether others could accept me too. And I think that is the crux of unworthiness, right? and why it's so confusing for people like me and maybe like you who do have pretty high self-esteem, who do have a pretty high sense of self-worth, to understand how we could still feel unworthy in the eyes of others. And that's because many of us have this foundation, like the foundation of our being, the foundation of our identity, the foundation in who we know ourselves to be, is this unworthiness that our family placed onto us, right? And this is not to blame our families. It's not to blame my mother, my father, my brothers, my cousins, whatever. I've forgiven all of them, and I've understood that the reason why they were the way that they were, right, is because they were also in a cycle as well, right? They were also in a cycle of feeling unworthy. They were also in a cycle of feeling inadequate. They were also in a cycle of feeling unaccepted, and had built up these walls and this mask of hardness, right, in order to protect themselves. And I think in a lot of ways, they were the way towards me that they were because they thought they were protecting me. They thought they were hardening me. They thought they were preparing me for the real world. And so many families, so as I was saying before my camera overheated, I feel like our families behave this way, not because, they hate us or they want us to suffer or because they want us to feel unworthy, but because they're dealing with unworthiness on their own, and they don't realize it themselves. And it just seems like they're behaving to us in the way that others behave towards them, because that's just the way that it goes. They're just repeating the cycle, right? And so much of growth and healing is recognizing cycles, recognizing these generational curses, right? And choosing to break them. So I'm going to wrap this video up now. Again, my name is Michael Sinclair. I'm a growth guide. I specialize in what I call inner child reconciliation, and that is going back and reclaiming the child that we thought we lost to time, reclaiming the child that we thought, was too damaged or too hurt or too neglected to bring with us into adulthood. And I've learned that's essential to being happy, because we can't exist as fragments, right? And in reality, we never lose our inner child. And in reality, in my opinion, we never really grow up, right? So if your inner child has been left in the past, then you're never really going to be a whole adult. And so, again, if this resonates with you, I hope that you'll stick around. This rest of the week, I'm going to speak more about worth and worthiness. I plan to make videos every week. If you'd like one-on-one guidance, I offer that. And then I also have a weekly newsletter centered around self-growth. You can find the links to that in the description. And I'll also post a link to yesterday's video or a card somewhere in this video. Thanks for taking the time to click on this video. I hope that it served you in some way. I hope that it brought you some value. And until we meet again, peace.